This podcast is produced by the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. The views expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. In addition, references to any specific companies, products, processes, or services does not necessarily constitute or imply endorsement by the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Welcome to CDP's podcast, Practical for Your Practice,
where we give you actionable intel to support what you do, one colleague to another. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Season 4. I can't believe it's Season 4 of Practical for Your Practice. And happily joined today by co-host Dr. Kevin Holloway. How's it going, Kevin?
Great. How you doing, Jenna?
I'm doing really well.
It has been quite a ride, right? I mean,
it's been quite a ride.
4 seasons.
Yeah.
Who would have thunk when we first started?
And we have some good news, bad news coming into Season 4. The bad news, which is good and has good news in it, is that Dr. Andy Santanello, who is by far one of the best podcast hosts anybody could ask for, is stepping away for a time to move on to some really exciting opportunities for him. And is unable to support the podcast, is going to definitely come back as a guest, which we're very excited about. So that's the bad news. The good news is we've had the very talented, incredible, funny, and engaging, now there's a lot of pressure, Dr. Carin Lefkowitz join us as our third host. So welcome to Practical for Your Practice hosting Dr. Lefkowitz.
Thank you. I like to think I'm a longtime guest, first-time host on the podcast. So I'm delighted to be here. And I did get the okay and the approval from Andy to momentarily step into his role. So I feel like I have his blessing to join you.
We're just hoping you can also maybe just wear the plaid shirts if you don't mind. That would help it feel like we were more consistent.
I'll do what I can.
In addition to Carin, we have, again, a repeat guest, a longtime guest, Dr. Kelly Chrestman, joining us as well. So hi, Kelly. How's it going?
Going okay. I am a longtime guest.
You are. You're a frequent flyer. We like our frequent flyers. But there's a really important reason why Kelly is here today. And Carin is going to certainly add to this mix, because the topic of today's podcast is one that comes up for us in consultation repeatedly. As you know, just to frame this, Kevin and I are consultants for prolonged exposure therapy, the EBP prolonged exposure therapy for PTSD. And Carin Lefkowitz is a trainer and consultant for cognitive processing therapy, which is another evidence-based psychotherapy for PTSD. Carin, by the way, also does PE. And so the topic we wanted to talk about that pops up for us often, or pops up for consultees, is what happens if my client dissociates? How do I handle dissociation in the context of wanting to provide an EBP for PTSD? And, it doesn't throw things totally off the rails. So that's why we've got this sort of quorum of folks here today. And that's what we're going to leap off and talk about.
And ironically, it might come up in consultation more often than it comes up in therapy, right? But
well, let's actually go there, right? So First of all, can we define it? Like, what does it mean when our consultants come to us and use that phrase dissociation? What do they mean? What, just for our listeners, like, we want to kind of start on the same page. What is dissociation and what isn't? And maybe I'll throw that one to Kelly.
If you want to be technical about it, you can go to DSM-5 and you can look at how the DSM-5 defines dissociation. And since we're talking about PTSD treatments, we'll look under the PTSD diagnosis. So there's a couple of kinds of dissociation that DSM recognizes as potentially being part of PTSD. So depersonalization is one. And this is sort of feeling detached, or like you're an outside observer of your own experiences, or outside of your body, kind of an out-of-body experience. And then derealization is more like out there. I'm sort of detached from out there. Everything feels kind of unreal, or I'm not connected to it in some way, sort of like other people might also describe that as numbing. And we do think, I think a lot of people think of dissociation as sort of an extreme form of numbing in some ways. Although when we get asked about it in consultation, that's not usually what people are asking about. They're asking about things that look a little bit scarier, like people becoming emotionally overwhelmed, which is not dissociation, or people becoming really unable to respond to the therapist, which might be dissociation.
It's like that spectrum, right, that we forget about. Falls on a spectrum, just like so many other qualities and symptoms and characteristics. And, its mildest form that is not necessarily even unhealthy can be momentarily losing touch with where you are right now and being on kind of autopilot, doing routine things. And then, of course, at the other extreme is dissociative identities and multiple personalities and things like that. But there's everything in between. And my point was going to be that I think what we get asked about in consultation so often is more about worries about that extreme end, forgetting that it so often falls on the milder end of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. I think we see mild forms of dissociation a lot and probably don't even recognize them because they're momentary. I mean, the best, people always want therapy examples, but the best example I can give you for dissociation that you can look at is if you remember the movie with Tom Cruise, the Born on the 4th of July movie. Remember that movie? Do you remember the scene where he was at a 4th of July celebration and he was getting honored and he was I think he was even in his uniform and they were playing the music and he was sort of in the process of doing something. And then you hear this baby cry in the audience. And all of a sudden kind of his face becomes really blank and he's not paying attention to anything that's going on around him. And we know, because we've seen the movie, that he's recalling an experience where he heard a similar sound in a traumatic setting, in a traumatic event. And it lasted seconds and then it was done. And after he was dissociative for this short little period of time, he got back on board with what they were doing. Now, his mood had changed. Everything had changed. The meanings of things had changed for him after that dissociative experience. But it was so momentary that most of the people in the audience probably, if that were a real thing that were happening and the audience were watching, they wouldn't have noticed that he was dissociative. They wouldn't have said, oh, look, what happened to Tom up there,
That was going to be one of my clarifying questions too, is like, when does it tend to happen and what's the function? Like, what's the function of it in terms of like for the patient? And there's not one answer to that, but like, it doesn't just happen, usually there's a reason it's happening and there's something about it that is working for the patient or, not really truly, but it's serving a function.
I think that's important to remember. I think dissociation does serve a function for the patient. And when we think about people who are highly dissociative or who dissociate in response to things that are painful, is that that's a skill they developed. And it serves a function of taking away some of the emotional connection to a painful experience. And I think folks that write about dissociation talk about people being more maybe having a proneness toward dissociation, even outside having traumatic experiences and things like that. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I know for folks who have traumatic experiences and they have difficulty enduring those painful emotions, that they can become detached during the experience in order to sort of cope with that experience. And if you do that a lot and you become good at it, it can become your go-to for emotional pain. So it's a skill. And if it works, you use it all the time. So people
And you're more likely to see it then if somebody's developed that skill, gotten a lot of practice at it, you're more likely to see it when they're distressed, because that's when they employ that skill. Right. I mean, going back to kind of that continuum of expression, I guess that's one of the things that when I've gotten questions about dissociation, like, again, that's kind of what folks are having in mind, is that extreme end of the continuum, right? Where they're fully, if you will, immersed in an intrusive memory, like full on flashback. They're unaware of their present location, what's going on around them currently. Like they're so into this intrusive memory that they're seeing, hearing, smelling, experiencing as though their memory of this event was happening again, right? They're totally there, and they may be unresponsive to the therapist. They may be maybe reenacting things going on in the memory. Like I'll tell you, I've had one client in probably all of my experience doing PE, who I think was kind of towards that end of the dissociative spectrum during some of our work together, and they were, calling out orders that they had at the time, of their traumatic experience that they were calling out during that time. Part of their memory, they're kind of reenacting it, but like it was really kind of encompassing, right? And like you said, like we see dissociation happening in lots of different ways. Sometimes that emotional numbing, sometimes, they may have an awareness that they're in the office talking to a therapist and yet still maybe getting a little deeper involved in that memory. But I think it's that extreme side that people are most worried about because it feels different, right? Like it's almost like it has this, I don't even know if like this is the right word, but it almost has like this supernatural quality to it, right? Like something else is going on that we have
like
maybe
something
not
took over the patient.
Yeah. Right.
It has a mystical quality.
Like there's some entity that we don't have access to now that's in control or something.
Yeah. And I think the next piece, the related piece of that, why it's so scary and why it comes up in consultation is that if it seems like it's something that's outside of our control and outside of the patient's control, then we don't know what to do with it. How do we put our patient back together when they dissociate and they get taken over by this demon or they lose contact with reality? I think clinicians are afraid to go anywhere near there because then they won't know how to get them back because they've been taken over.
And so we, maybe we as therapists are avoidant, right? We're not, asking our clients to continue to experience some of this distress because they're worried that we'll push them over some edge or that, we'll push them into some dissociative reaction. And then, nobody's getting better or maybe that's the worry. Or maybe the worry is somebody might get hurt. Maybe they'll reenact something that might actually injure somebody themselves. I think that those are some of those perhaps, unlikely, but still realistic, valid concerns that people might have.
So if it's not a mythical thing taking over and it's not a demon, what is it?
So it's a skill. It's a preferential skill. So maybe it's the absence of other skills that allows this skill to become overdeveloped or be the preferential skill that people use. So I think when people always just want to know, like, what do I do about dissociation? And it really depends, right? Like everything else, like it depends how many other skills your client has. It depends how strongly they dissociate and what happens when they dissociate. If you have a client who walks around in everyday life and everyday life activities are triggering them to dissociate in ways where they lose time or become extremely upset and emotional and unable to function in public and things like that. The question really shouldn't be, how can I do PE with them right now? The question should be, how can I help them be safe as they walk around in their lives? Because we don't do PE with people who are who have other safety concerns that are more urgent than their PTSD symptoms. And in that case, I would say a person who dissociates to that level needs to learn some skills to manage that dissociation before we engage in an activity like PE or even CPT, where the therapy itself is designed to come into contact with those difficult emotions. And they're going to need some skills when they get there to manage the difficult emotion. So, one of our colleagues, Melanie Harned, works with borderline personality disorder folks who also have PTSD, and she does the DBT PE protocol with them. And they have a really nice way of categorizing whether you need to do the DBT PE protocol or whether you can just start PE. And they really talk about the patients who need the DBT PE protocol as patients who are really in that category we were talking about, where their level of dissociation, their level of self-injurious behavior, their level of coping with emotion that's difficult is so impaired that doing PE might be dangerous for them, that it would cause them to become so overwhelmed that would increase those behaviors. So they need to learn other skills before they move into the phase of doing PE. But when we talk about most of the patients that we deal with, we're starting PE right away because our patients have some rudimentary skills, even if they're dissociative. At times, they have some rudimentary skills or even some advanced skills that they can use to help with that.
I think that's such an important distinction because the way that you're talking about it is which is how I've often thought about it, as dissociation is a skill or a coping mechanism, even that they have relied on because perhaps that was the only mechanism available at that time, or the trauma was so intense that's all they could muster. But it also doesn't mean it's their only mechanism and skill. So it seems to me like part of that assessment should be, where does the dissociation fit in? Are there other skills that the patient already has besides, or mechanisms that the patient already has besides dissociation, or do we need to build those in first? And to me, that's an important piece of the assessment.
Right. And I think from the point of view of some therapists, and this is not our point of view, but is that we should shore those skills up to max before we bring somebody into PE. And nobody's got time for that. And in fact, we don't need that. We know that people can cope with the demands of prolonged exposure without a long preamble of skills and other types of therapy before we get there. But there is a small percentage of people who do need some skill building before they move in.
Well, so I think that's one of the things that I think I've encountered too, is there's concern or there's worry or questions from providers about, how you might do that. How do you know where the line is about where do you need to build up skill first, or where do you jump right in? Because I don't know that it's necessarily the fear of somebody that they've got a client, they know they tend to dissociate because they've overlearned that skill. Like, that's manifested itself in lots of different places. And so we kind of know we need to help this person develop some additional skills before we get into exposure work if we're doing PE. Sometimes the worry is that I'm not going to know until they're already there, right? Like, we've started, like if we're doing PE, we've started
by surprise. It's going to take over.
We started a magical exposure, and we were expecting them to feel distressed, and we were expecting them to, as their eyes are closed and they're revisiting their memory, maybe they're breathing harder and they're feeling, they're reporting SUDS. But kind of it's this worry that out of the blue now somebody's going to flip, right, and start dissociating and be unresponsive, and then what do we do if they're unresponsive to us anyway, right? And so there's that piece of it, but then there's also this piece of, well, the stuff we would typically do with somebody who tends to dissociate or whatever feels like it's antithetical to PE, right? It's just helping people to avoid better, I think, is one way of looking at that. And so there's this worry that if we are addressing dissociation, maybe we can't do PE anymore because it's kind of the opposite of PE, where really, like you were just saying, Melanie Harnett is just talking about, well, those two things can go together. We really can address this. And it's not that PE and I think CPT as well, correct me if I'm wrong, Carin, that the protocols are so rigid that you can't make adjustments to deal with that, to address that. That's kind of part of the beauty of, I guess, more modern protocol therapies, is that there really is adjustments that can be made on the fly to deal with, to address when a client is having this kind of a reaction. So Absolutely. I don't know, I threw two things at you, so I don't know if you want to address them differently or what.
Are you asking me or Carin?
Either one. I mean, just then kind of the idea, I know I threw two things. One is this worry that it's going to be unanticipated, come out of the blue, surprise us in the middle of therapy, and then what do we do? And then there's this other idea that if we are, if it does happen, if it does come up, the stuff I'm maybe not even used to doing, because I don't know that most therapists see a lot of people who are dissociating all the time, but the kinds of things that we may have learned how to deal with dissociation maybe feel antithetical to this protocol we're trying to do. So what do you do then too? So two things.
So I don't, there's a lot of things in there, Kevin. I don't know if there's only two.
I can't count past two. That's the problem.
So dissociation, it sort of gets a really bad rap, and deservedly so in some cases. But some other things that get bad raps in therapy are avoidance and distraction. And, in PE, we try to get people to not distract. We want them to focus on their. But when you think about it, all of those things occur on a continuum, and all of them are functional behaviors at any given time. There are times when avoidance makes the most sense of anything at all. And in fact, one of the ways to distraction, one of the ways that I think about dissociation is just in a pure sense, it's not being in contact with something that you should be in contact with. So we're all sitting here talking. There are lots of things going on in the room around me. I'm focusing on mainly our conversation, but I'm also aware of sun coming in over here in the window. And but I'm not focused on, I'm not thinking about it. And it's not distracting me from the conversation. But if I were dissociative, what happens when somebody dissociates is it's not that they lose contact with everything, is that they're contacting one thing too closely in a lot of instances. So this memory I'm drawn into it's almost like it's similar to overengagement, but it's overengagement to the extreme. So I'm only able to focus on the painful experience that I'm having as I'm processing this emotion, and it's overwhelming to me. So it becomes non-productive, and dissociation is the result. So what I want to introduce in that situation is distraction. But I don't really call it distraction. I might call it prompting more so that they hear my voice more. Or I might have them, have some tactile distraction, like focusing on body sensations that are happening in the room, like the feeling of the chair or the feet, there's something under their feet.
Things we would sometimes call grounding, right?
Grounding. Yeah. Some people call it grounding. I think grounding is a really imprecise term. And I think it also sounds magical. So I don't tend to use it. But I also think that we're talking about some of the same things. Melanie's done some really cool things with folks that are highly dissociative, almost to the extreme, where she will have them, I will have people sometimes lean forward. So they have a little bit more physical tension in their body rather than kind of leaning back into a recliner where there's nothing they have to do other than focus on this emotion. When you lean forward, you have to kind of use your muscles to hold yourself upright a little bit. Melanie will have people stand to do their imaginal exposure. And if that's not enough, sometimes she's had people stand on a balance board.
So I've heard of standing on one foot, kind of the same concept.
Or standing on one foot. And it's not that this is not distracting enough to bring them totally out of the processing of the memory or the recounting of the memory, but it's enough of a distraction that their body has to be doing something else while they're doing this. So it's like there are several processes going on at once, which is what normally we're doing when we're living our lives or talking about things or engaging in any kind of activity. And so distraction even isn't a bad skill. And so when you think about it from that point of view, we can use distraction sometimes to pull people back in, and the distraction of our voice, the distraction of tactile sensations, the distraction of physical tension in the body. She's used ice water so that people, and so there are lots of things like that you can do to help people who are dissociative. But remember, even all of these things we're talking about right now, those are extreme forms of dissociation that are going to require those kinds of things. For most of our clients, prompting a little more. Now, what I would do even before that is if I've noticed my client is dissociative or tends to dissociate when they talk about the traumatic experience, I'm going to know that before we do imaginal exposure, because I've already assessed them and I've assessed how they're able to tell me about the trauma in the first place. And, how hard was it for them? What did they look like? Were they able, was there any emotion going on when they told about it? Or were they really detached from that? Were they numb even when they were talking? So I have some anticipation of how that's going to go even before we do imaginal exposure.
Can I add to that really quickly? Because I think that actually goes back to Kevin's other or initial question, which I think is really relevant of, clinicians worry that the dissociation is going to come out of nowhere. So you're going to start PE and all of a sudden, or you're going to start CPT or any treatment and suddenly find out that your client is dissociative. And I think, Kelly, you're making the point that I wanted to make, which is that you will have signs because you don't jump into PE the first day that you meet a patient or CPT. So you have cues, including exactly what you're saying, which is how do they talk to you about the trauma initially? How do they talk to you about their history? How do they talk to you about their symptoms? And many patients will actually tell you outright, I'm walking my dog and all of a sudden I'm back in that room, or I'm watching TV and all of a sudden I'm back on the field. So they will tell you in different ways the types of dissociation, if any, that they engage in. So it's not that surprise that I think some clinicians worry about, Kevin, that you described. And I just wanted to make sure I got that in there. No,
I think it's such a good point. Is that a lot of times, we talk about our clients having a lot of anticipatory anxiety. We talk about how that can really sometimes even be worse than the anxiety of reapproaching some of these things. And I think us as therapists have that too, right? This anticipatory anxiety that our client's going to fall apart or, discombobulate while we're doing imaginal exposure or other kinds of interventions. And I think the point you're making is a huge one, that this doesn't happen nearly as often as we worry about it. And when it does happen, we tend to have a heads up, if we're paying attention, that this person has learned this skill, employs it to manage some of their distress. And so it's very rare, if at all, that it happens that it's just literally out of nowhere. You had no idea that this was coming, and then there's nothing that we can do about that.
Right.
Can I ask Carin too? I feel like we've been talking a lot about PE and providers express this concern in consultation. If I start imaginal, that's when it's going to happen. From a CPT standpoint, when you're doing consultation, when does some of this provider anxiety or questions about dissociation, are there certain parts of CPT or moments in CPT or not really? Just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. There are. Frankly, I'll say in the training, as soon as we say that CPT is a trauma-focused treatment, immediately somebody asks, well, what about with somebody who's dissociative, right? So it's from the very outset when you recognize that CPT is still a trauma-focused treatment, even if it's not exposure-based. But then the question definitely comes up when it's time to write the impact statement, which happens at the end of the first session. When, for those who are not familiar, you're asking the patient to write why the event happened, not the details of what happened, but why the event happened. So anxiety has come up there. And then for those of you who don't already know, there are two different versions of CPT. There's CPT with a written trauma narrative and CPT without a written trauma narrative. The standard at this point is actually without the written trauma narrative for a lot of reasons that I don't know that are relevant to this particular discussion.
Well, that's like a whole series of episodes, right?
Whole other episode. But CPT with the written account, if you choose to do that with clients, then when they're going to write the details of the event in sessions 3 and 4, of course, that's a point where clinicians get anxious. Interestingly enough, guess which approach tends to be best for those folks who tend to have a lot of dissociation? Actually having them write the written account leads to greater benefit. Research
I was going to guess. You didn't let me guess.
I'm sorry. Wait, let's rewind.
Well, let me write it.
Yes, for 5 points. Which version?
Thank you.
Well, and interestingly though, too, even in the version without the written trauma narrative, at least, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but there's still a lot of work around, how is that memory showing up in day-to-day, activities and recognizing, identifying what are some of those unhelpful cognitions related to that and how that shows up too. And so I imagine there's a number of opportunities, if you will, for distress and anxiety to go up, and then for people to fall back to what they know, what has maybe perhaps worked a little bit to manage some of their distress if they're so inclined.
Exactly right. And I feel like you could substitute any other treatment. We're not talking about EMDR. We're not talking about written exposure therapy, but all of those have the same notion, right? Because it's trauma-focused treatments, and then there's always the risk of dissociation. Which I guess maybe moves us to actionable intel and what we do about it now that we have talked around it.
Hey, Carin, you read my mind.
It was magical.
Well, and so yes, as in every episode, as Carin just said, like, we don't want to just talk about it. We want to try and, give our listeners, our colleagues, our friends, some tools or some things to shore up, sort of feel more secure around this or learn more about it. What are a few things that you would recommend providers do, in this sort of, I'm not summarizing it very well. What should they do to learn more about dissociation, and what to do about it if it pops up clinically, and move it from mystery and mystification to skills and behaviors we can help shape to make EBPs more successful?
I guess you're assuming that Kelly is just not going to treat all of our patients for us. That's not the answer.
I think one of the things I would like people to do when they work with trauma patients is assess them really well. And that might sound like, oh, duh, well, of course we should do that. But I think people don't assess dissociation very well. And they don't have their sort of, and I don't mean like giving a DES, which is a great instrument and people can give that, but I mean more just listening to how your client speaks. As Kevin was talking about earlier, like, is it easy for them to talk about it? Do they look detached when they're telling you about the experience that they've had? And when they do, ask them how they feel about that. Do you feel detached from that experience as you talk about it? Does that happen at other times? And when it happens, how long does it last? What do you do to kind of get back into contact with reality? And many patients will have answers for that. And so those are what you do in therapy too. So when, for example, someone's doing imaginal exposure and I've already assessed them and I know that they have a tendency to dissociate, I might say, before we start the imaginal exposure, if you feel like you're, backing off from this memory and maybe dissociating a bit as you have done in the past, how about if you hold your finger up? Can they predict? And this is something I usually assess with people who are dissociative: is can they predict when it's going to happen? Mm-hmm. Most can. They know the things that cause them to dissociate. And they can sort of feel that it doesn't take them by surprise either. It can feel like it sneaks up on them if you're not paying attention. But if you do a chain analysis and look at what happens prior to dissociation, you can see the things that start to predict it. And the client can do this too. So they can hold their finger up. I can then talk more, prompt more. I can say, why don't you open your eyes for this part and talk through this part with your eyes open. And I can use my voice. I can use my prompts to kind of keep them more present. Whereas with another client, I might be more silent and not be interrupting their narrative so much. So assess well so that you can kind of predict what to do. If you have a client who doesn't have skills and can't predict it, then don't start doing imaginal exposure until you've done some work with them to help them develop the skill of being able to predict when they're going to dissociate. So if they say, I absolutely don't know when it happens, it just takes me by surprise, then before you go to PE, the treatment plan needs to address how can you predict this more and be able to be more functional when it starts to happen, and how can you recognize the signs so that you can back off from what's happening and not dissociate. Because we don't, the answer to people say, what do I do if my client dissociates during imaginal exposure? My answer is always don't let them dissociate during imaginal exposure.
Don't let it get that far.
Don't do it. Don't let it go that far. Watch for the signs. Pull them back before that happens. And the same is true for overengagement, by the way, but dissociation as well. We don't want our clients to overengage because it takes a while to clean that up and pack that all back together. Whereas if you prevent it happening in the first place because you know the signs and your client knows the signs and you're kind of working your way through it, then it feels safer for the client. Dissociation doesn't feel safe for clients. They don't like the feeling of it. It feels destabilizing. And therapists feel the same way. So best not to have that happen. But if it happens, it's not a disaster. You can help walk that back, and you can use whatever happened during the session that caused the dissociation to do a chain analysis and find out what is it about what we were talking about that caused you to check out? When did you first notice that you were checking out? Did it happen very suddenly or did it happen in a couple of seconds? And can you go through what happened in those seconds? And when you know the answers to those questions, you can work with that situation in the future to prevent it happening.
How do we help our listeners or providers out there to develop that skill, right? Because one of the other things that tends to happen a lot, at least with new PE therapists, is that where that line is feels like we get there a lot sooner than it actually is, right? Like for most clients, I'm not talking about just our dissociative clients, but for most clients, they can handle more than perhaps we think they can when we first start doing PE or other kind of trauma-focused therapies. And so part of the learning and how to develop this new skill is, trying to help our clients stay engaged a little further than they think they can go, maybe a little further than we think they can go, but then balancing that with this idea of not letting them get to the point of dissociation. Do we have like resources we can point somebody to like, how do they build this skill of recognizing it? Because it doesn't happen a lot. So it's not like you just kind of naturally develop the skill over time after you see a lot of clients, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. So what can people do to become more familiar with it? I think there are articles you can read on dissociation. We can include some with the show notes if you want, that help people kind of think about it in a less mystical way. But one of the best resources that I've come across recently, and it's relatively new, but it's not super new, is Melanie's book. Melanie Harnett has recently written a book about DBT PE. It's the protocol. And even though this form of PE is not applicable for all clients, I think the way that she breaks things down so carefully for those most disturbed clients is really helpful, even when you're working with less disturbed clients, because it helps you think through what's happening for them. So, if you can read her book and look at some of the things she does with some of these really severe clients, you don't have to do quite that much work with the less disturbed clients, but the skills are the same. And so I think that's like, it's a tiny resource in one book that has a whole lot of stuff that would be helpful for people working with anyone who has PTSD, even some of the most difficult clients.
So like we always do, we're going to put links and everything in the show notes for folks who have been listening along and hearing references to articles and the books and things like that and resources. So we'll have those in the show notes. Just wanted to make mention, not as a plug or anything, but the name of the book by Melanie Harnett that Kelly's referring to is called Treating Trauma in Dialectical Behavior Therapy. So if you're looking for a book called DBT-PE, you won't find it, but it's called Treating Trauma in Dialectical Behavior Therapy by Melanie S. Harnett. And then her website, we'll put in the show notes too, is dbtpe.org.
So I think that very naturally brings us to the point of summarizing and wrapping up the episode, which, I mean, I'm just going to step right in as first-time host and try and see how terrible of a job I do. But I love this discussion, getting all of our different perspectives on this. We've had different experiences and different backgrounds of training and experience. So I feel like we've got a nice full picture of dissociation here. And if I was going to summarize, I would say that some of the things that I heard or that we talked about was first the importance of assessing as a clinician. So taking the time at the outset, not just to ask dissociation specific questions or using dissociation specific tools like the DES, but just noticing clients' reactions to what you're already asking, noticing their answers to the questions that you're already asking, noting how they react when you talk about the trauma, and also what they tell you about their own everyday experience, because you can often hear plenty of signs of dissociation through your assessment. Then work with your client to figure out how aware they are of their dissociative tendency. So if they are quite familiar with it and they have a sense of when they're doing it, you can work pretty easily with them to predict when it's going to happen, what some of the warning signs are, when they notice is changing in them, or what they notice might be triggering that dissociative episode. Of course, if they're not as aware of it or as knowledgeable of it, then your job as a clinician becomes a little bit harder to really work more directly in helping them predict that, helping them with that chain analysis that Kelly described. As we discussed, as a clinician, you want to have your repertoire of skills that you're ready to utilize when you have a sense that your client tends to be dissociative. And that might include those techniques that we lump under grounding, the umbrella term grounding. Of course, we also have additional resources and materials like the Melanie Harned book that we've noticed, and DBT and PE materials in general. Kelly's mentioned some of the techniques that we use as part of PE when we have kind of an overengaged or even outright dissociative client. I would also stress from the CPT side, consider CPT plus A. Consider using the written narrative if you're doing CPT. And finally, don't forget that we're here for consultation. So you can actually access all of us either in the PE CLC or the CPT monthly virtual office hours, which we can put links to that in the show notes as well. Correct? How'd I do, guys? Anybody?
Hired.
She's hired. She's hired. She can stay around. I'm in. No, truly fabulous job. I think it's exciting to be back for season 4, and this is a great way to kick it off. Kelly, thank you so much for coming back again. And Carin, we just can't quit you. So we look forward to having you join us in the host seats here. And welcome back to all of you listeners. That we are glad you've joined us back for season 4. And we look forward to you joining our next episode. And thanks again for listening in about dissociation.
And we want to hear from you all, like you, our listeners, like tell us what you want to hear about. What are the questions that you have or reactions to other episodes that you've heard so far? So we'd love your feedback. We want you to participate. If you'd like to even have your voice be a part of a future episode, leave us a voicemail at speakpipe.com/CDPP4P. That's speakpipe.com/PD. I messed it up. Speakpipe.com/CDPP4P. So that's Center for Deployment Psychology, practical for your practice. And you can leave a voicemail right there that if we have your permission, we'd be happy to include in a future episode too, as we're addressing the questions you're bringing up. So be part of the conversation. Join us.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. Thanks for listening to Practical for Your Practice.
Please feel free to subscribe, like, and share.
Until next time.